they don't necessarily have the best of relationships. I don't think those two. Sandra Jansen has said that Rick McIver hasn't had her back for months, so I'm not at all surprised that she didn't really reach out and say, yo, what's up, Rick? I'm out.
I mean, floor crossings are always controversial, and the last time we had a floor crossing in Alberta, it was a mass floor crossing. It's not like they're completely uncommon, but, you know, we do have this taste in our mouth, all of us, from when the Wild Rose, a dozen MLAs, including their leader, their leader, Danielle Smith, crossed the floor. And so that is our most recent experience with floor crossings, and we know how that went for both the party that accepted them and the people who left. There were serious consequences for that choice. This is different, I think, in that we have one person going over, Sandra Jansen from the NDP. There is a lot of people have said she'll never get elected again. Not so sure about that, because we do have a history in Alberta also of re-electing people who have crossed the floor. You had Rob Anderson when he crossed from the PCs to the Wild Rose, and Heather Forsyth when she crossed to the Wild Rose. They got re-elected as Wild Rose MLAs. You had Raj Sherman going from the PCs to the Liberals. You also had Jean Swazdeski, this is going way back into ancient history now, going from the Liberals to the Progressive Conservatism, getting re-elected time and time again. So it is not necessarily, you know, the end for her. It is entirely possible that her constituents, the majority of them, could look at this and decide they're comfortable with it 3 years from now if she decides. I mean, it's, you know, it's a long time before the next provincial election.
It's interesting because there was a lot of pushback in the political community from people, from the same people who hate Sandra Jansen when she was a progressive conservative. The very people who drove her out of the party were, of course, outraged when, as a logical consequence of being driven out of her party, she left her party. So the hypocrisy of that was a bit too delicious. But I think there are also people who really don't understand how a Westminster parliamentary system works. And they said to me, well, she was elected as a conservative. And I said to people, yes, but also in our system of government, which we've inherited from Great Britain, MLAs and MPs are not the creatures of the leader. They are, in fact, the people who choose the leader from amongst themselves. And if a leader loses the confidence of an MLA or an MP, they not only have a right, but in some cases a higher moral duty to cross the floor. Floor crossing isn't against the rules. It's embedded in the rules of what makes a parliamentary system work. And so, you know, when people said to me, no one should ever cross the floor ever, it's like, no, that's antithetical to hundreds and hundreds of years of parliamentary tradition. I mean, Winston Churchill, you know, the king of parliamentarians, didn't cross the floor just once, but twice. I called him a double crosser, but I think Churchill's phrase was, I ratted and then I re-ratted. I described it on Twitter last night as a giant game of Red Rover, and people said to me, but it's not a game. And yes, actually, it is, and that's how it's played. Now, what the consequences will be for Sandra Jansen, who ran as a progressive, who only beat the NDP in her Calgary riding by 600 votes. I mean, people voted for Sandra Jansen, and I think that's why she survived the great Tory wipeout. People voted for her because she was a red Tory who was an outspoken advocate for LGBTQ rights and abortion rights, and I think that people didn't just vote the party in her particular instance.
She's going to endure a lot more abuse because of this decision, right? She's already shown herself to, well, not shown herself, she's already claimed that she's been the target of a lot of intimidation as a member of the Progressive Conservatives. So going to the NDP isn't going to help that in some ways, probably going to bring more on. Will be interesting to see if she potentially becomes a cabinet minister at some point. That could affect her decision whether she runs again or not, and whether she's reelected. But I think it was interesting, like this does, I think it's another example, and perhaps even helps to exacerbate this growing polarization we're seeing in Alberta politics right now, where Sandra Jansen goes from, you know, a fairly right party to the leftist party we have in the province, with nothing in between. There is no progressive option that she saw in between the NDP and the Conservatives to join. The Alberta Party apparently wasn't a major consideration for her. The Progressive Conservative, she feels, is no longer the party she signed up with, and they've drifted to the right. So it is interesting to see who might fill that void at some point if we're setting up an election between two fairly extreme parties.
When Jansen pulled out of the leadership race, I had a lot of people saying to me on Twitter, well, she wasn't a real conservative anyway.
So
and
many
I was
people
like,
said
I was
that,
like, yeah,
yeah.
but see, she was a conservative. She was a conservative cabinet minister. I mean, she was more a conservative than Jason Kenney, who only bought his membership 5 minutes ago. I mean, so who owns the copyright on the word conservative? The Progressive Conservative Party of Peter Lougheed and Don Getty is not the party that Jason Kenney is running to lead. And people said to me, well, Lougheed, he's dead. Lougheed, I wasn't even alive when he was premier. And I thought, well, okay, if you want to throw out, a good chunk of that 44-year legacy, maybe don't call yourself the Conservative Party. Go find another name. Oh, wait, not Wildrose. That one's taken. But, and people who I think are also misremembering would be a kind way of putting it, the actual legacy of Ralph Klein, who, for all his fiscal cost cutting, wasn't a social conservative. If anything, Klein spent, a good part of his tenure keeping the social conservatives in the tent by, throwing them the odd bit of meat, but he was never one of them. And I think he always stayed in power by keeping them tapped down to the best extent that he could. The tension in Alberta has long been between, the so-cred legacy, which the Wildrose embodies, and that progressive center. If there is no progressive center, I would highly recommend to Rachel Notley that she tack immediately in that direction.